if my identity truly was in Christ instead of in my job, I knew better. Then it would have been the same person in Christ an hour before I left the compound as I was an hour after I left the compound.
One of the things I love about this book is that, people are so obsessed with true crime right now. Everybody's listening to the podcasts and all of that. And so, you've lived the true crime life. You've, of course, investigated all of these cold cases, and each chapter tells a different story. I would love for you to talk about one of the standout chapters for me was when you were talking about your last day on the job. So here you've been a cop for decades. You are a very successful cold case homicide detective, even being on, is it Dateline, right? With Keith Morrison and him calling you the evidence whisperer. So you have all this success. And then on your last day on the job, you decide to go back to like the beat cop. Is that what they call it? Beat cop? Is that offensive to a cop to say that?
I was a patrol officer. We had a beat, and my son was working as a patrol officer. And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool? I never heard anyone do that. We've got a couple of father-son duos on our agency over the years, but I was not aware of anyone who had actually had a chance to work together the last day. So I asked to do that. And here we were standing. This is one of the chapters. I think it's an important chapter for me personally, but I think it's an important chapter for all of us, because you just mentioned it a minute ago, is where Mike Winger says, well, look, if we're looking inside ourselves, there's only 3 ways we form identity. And I try to talk about that in this chapter, because as we're standing at this attempted suicide, and I realize the reason why many of us get to that point is because we've had a dramatic shift in how we see ourselves. It turns out, as a matter of fact, if you were to look at your life and look at all those valleys we talked about in your life, if you went to the bottom of that valley, you discover at the same time you suffered a trauma, accompanying that trauma was a dramatic shift in the way you saw yourself. Oh, I used to be a married person. Now I'm divorced. Oh, I used to be employed in this. Now I'm fired. It's an identity. It's how you think of yourself. And when those things shift. So if all you wanted to do was guard against the lowest lows in your life, you ought to pursue an identity it can't be stolen from you. That transcends your experiences. And I had realized as I'm standing in that crime scene, or that potential suicide scene, that later in that shift, I got done with the shift with Jimmy, took a bunch of pictures, gave him my old, some equipment out of my locker, and drove out the compound, and was shook by the fact that I was no longer who I had been just an hour ago.
Yeah.
Like I was now a was. Jimmy is an is.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I struggle with the same thing this guy in the room has struggled with. And I realized that you only can form your identity one of 3 ways. And I'm not the person who created these criteria. I'm Eric Erickson. There's a lot of people who have done good work on identity. And I cite all of it in the book. But you either form it from the outside in, where you look around you and you say, what's out there that I could identify with? It's my tribe, my nation, the profession of my family, whatever it may be. And you and I have both done some of that, right? You come from a family that was musical. You see that. You kind of, I did the same thing, a 3-generation law enforcement family. So that's an outside-in approach. The ancients typically did that. Oh, we're carpenters, we're farmers, we're coal miners, whatever it may be. And then you have another way, which is inside out, which is probably how the most popular way that people are forming their identity today. And you're right, Mike Winger's right. If you're looking at what those kind of innate desires you have, even your sexual preferences, or your giftedness, I'm good at this. I look inside myself to see what attribute of me do I identify and want to proclaim to a world that I then require to identify me this way. Well, that's kind of an inside-out approach, and we also can do that, right? Like I'm good at certain things, and I saw myself identifying with the things that I was good at, my desires, my strengths. Sometimes people have been identified with their weaknesses. But both of those, by the way, are open to being changed radically. Number one, you can have that thing you've identified with stolen from you. Once you retire from that profession, trust me. I tell people all the time, don't retire from something, retire to something, because so much of what you do is your identity. That can change. 2, if you're forming it from the inside out, you don't think your heart's going to change, your desires are going to change over the course of a lifetime. If you don't, you're not paying attention. So is there a third way in which you can suffer less change in identity? Well, that's the way that I should have understood because I already was a Christian at the time I retired. And if you put your, I call it top side down, if you look up and put your identity in the transcendent God who created you, well, then I can realize if my identity truly was in Christ instead of in my job, I knew better. Then it would have been the same person in Christ an hour before I left the compound as I was an hour after I left the compound. Again, you can suffer a low, but your identity doesn't change much because you've placed it in something other than your circumstances or your desires.
Mm.
And so I think that's why it's so important for us to, and this is like, so when I was thinking about this as it happened and realizing, yeah, I want to write about it because I felt like I did write about it a little bit on a blog. A lot of the stuff that is in this book is stuff I had been writing about at Cold Case Christianity for a lot of years, but just touching on it.
Yeah.
And I thought this could help some people who are struggling. And also the thing we learned in the last 5 years, working with police officers in marriage resiliency with the Billy Graham Association, is that these are what most of us, if you're injured on the job and you feel like your whole life has changed because you no longer can do the job,
Right.
the first thing that happens to those officers, male or female, is that they struggle with, who am I now? Also, how did I get hurt? Did I do something? In other words, I thought I was a tactically sound police officer, and then I get ambushed. And how did
Yeah.
that happen? Is something wrong with me? So those are the kinds of things I wanted to pursue in the book. But I think there's 15 attributes of human nature that I think most people will find surprising
Mm.
that really form who we are and contribute to our flourishing.
Yeah.
So I think that's what my goal in the book is, try to get those illustrated by way of crime stories.